of message series from the book of John, where it's talking about, Jesus addresses, asks a question to his disciples, who do you say that I am? And then he basically turns around and answers the question through the series. I can read better with this. Who do you say that I am? And when he first asked that question, the disciples gave all kinds of answers. And then he finally asked Peter, well, who do you say that I am? And the statement is referred to a lot of time as the Great Confession. Peter comes back and says, you are the Christ. But that same question, keeps coming to us. And this is actually kind of part 4. Today Leonard, we were looking at the portion where Jesus says, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. No one comes in to the sheepfold except through the door. And he says that anybody that comes any other way is a thief and a robber. And the literal example was that the shepherd would lay down in front of the sheepfold. There was only one way in, and he laid across that. And that's a beautiful example of what Jesus was saying, that no one comes into the sheepfold or to heaven or to the Father, comes into the flock unless you come through me. That's what he was getting across. He said anybody else that entered any other way, they were a thief and a robber. And one of the things that was mentioned was the fact that sheep have a tendency to fall. In those passages, it says that he leads them out. They come in and they go out. And we see that same thing in the Psalms 23. And he takes them out into the pastures to feed. And at night or in the evening, sometimes twice a day, they would come in to the sheepfold, depending upon where it was. But the other part that they went through was the fact that the sheep hear his voice. In the area around Jerusalem, they said that there would be these sheepfolds, but they would hold literally numerous flocks. And there was a gatekeeper, and he recognized the shepherd, and the shepherd would go in and call for his sheep, and his sheep only would come out. And we showed a little video at the end, which was kind of neat. In fact, let's see if I can back up to that. And play this little video, because it is kind of neat. You might have to unmute the portion there, Leonard. Or, I'm sorry, Luke.
One more time.
But in that video, it drove home the point that, the sheep hear the master's voice. They don't respond to someone else's. But in this, come to a point where one of the things we looked at was the characteristics of the sheep and the goats. And because a lot of the sheepfolds actually have a couple of goats in them. And one of the videos watched from Perry Stone, he was talking about this. In fact, the one video or scene where it showed the shepherd with the thickets, and he was standing from Nazareth village. Well, Perry Stone did an interview at that same location and was talking to the project manager and talking about different things from that series. But in this tonight, we're going to look at this section that's called basically the sheep and the goats. And there's a passage that comes into play in Zechariah chapter 10, verse 3. There's a passage about it. It says, "My anger is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the goat herders. For the Lord of hosts will visit his flock, the house of Judah, and he will make them as his royal horse in the battle." It's kind of got a negative content towards the goat herders and the shepherds, and that's kind of part of what Jesus was driving across to the Pharisees and them was, you haven't been the shepherds of the flock like you're supposed to have been. He was saying, I am the good shepherd. You've been given sheep to take care of, and you failed on you were more interested in yourself. And I think that's part of where he talks about the hireling in those passages. They were hireling because the hirelings, Jesus said, as soon as the wolf comes, he runs away. He leaves the sheep to the wolf catches them and scatters the flock. There's another passage that's probably the more well-known that deals with the goats and the sheep. And a lot of people relate this to the end times. In Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on the right, 'Come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did to the least one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they will all answer, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or stranger or naked or sick in prison and did not minister to you?' Then he will answer to them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.' And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." And he's talking about separating, the sheep and the goats here. There's an article I found. This gentleman, it's called "Goats on the Left" by Mike Ford, and he used several references, a couple of Bible dictionaries, but I pulled a lot from his. thing here because he had already gathered all the references. I could have went into my Bible software and pulled up all these different references that he had, but he kind of done most of the work. And I don't know, have you ever had any goats or messed with goats or anything like sheep? Leonard, did y'all have any? Well, we had our neighbors a couple years back had 2 goats, 3 of them. One was Molly and Burton Molly, and but I can relate to a lot of the things that this guy's portraying about goats in just their personalities, these 2 goats, because they were always getting out and coming over to our property, and that he'd come looking for them, trying to get them back in, and they're okay, they ain't hurting nothing, and eventually they'd go back over into the pasture. But he says, here's a couple of things about goats. Goats have some admirable qualities, what we would think would be admirable. They're intelligent, they're sensitive, they're playful, and Molly definitely was playful. She would actually chase and play with Audrey, and they're quick to respond to individual affection and attention. And these, we look at these and say, man, these are some admirable qualities. But on the other end, they can be the other way. They're intelligent, yeah, sensitive. But when we look at those things in a spiritual realm, if we get too sensitive, we can be letting our emotions carry us away. We can be kind of foolish at times. But the one that really stands out is that they're quick to respond to individual affection and attention. They're more self-centered, not the kind of the group. I love this picture of this goat here. It's like, look at me type deal. Got the big smile on. These are some of the traits that they display. Capix, how did you pronounce? Call this again? Anyway, it means given to sudden, say it again? Capricious. Given to sudden and unaccountable changes of moods or behavior. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think we see goats in the flock of the church. Once in a while, maybe not very often, but once in a while there's some, I think we got some goats. They're impulsive and unpredictable, devious and contrary. And again, man, when we look at some of these characteristics of these goats, there are some people that just love to stir, as we use the expression, love to stir the pot. There's kind of a little devious background, watch what I can do. Watch what I can stir here. Impulsive. How many times have we seen Christians sometimes, instead of stop and think and pray things out, react impulsively? Even sometimes in leadership, sometimes I've seen where the leadership of a church will sometimes just be impulsive and not stop to think of the consequences of what their actions can be bringing. This one, if you look at this picture, it's got the fence there. When they're grazing, it's not unusual to see several of them with their heads stuck through the fence, and that was Bert and Molly. Always, they were this deep in grass on their side, and they would be reaching through the fence, through the barbed wire fence, reaching for scraggly old weeds and stuff on the opposite side. It says they strain their reach for grass. It's always greener on the other side, and for me, I see this sometimes characterized in some Christians. They're always going to, from this church, we call them church hoppers, going from one church to another because it's always greener over here. They've got a better worship service, praise and worship team, or this pastor's better. It's always greener. In fact, there was one folklore that said that the reason the eyes on the goat is slanted so he could see around the corners because the grass was always greener on the around the corner. If they're not poking their heads through the fences, maybe standing on their hind legs, stretching for those tender leaves just out of reach, always. And there was one picture I seen of goats that were taken over, and I want to say it was Africa. And these goats were literally standing up on their very tiptoes, reaching for pieces of leaves. Some had actually gotten into the tree and were on the branches of the tree eating. When you're wondering, surely there's got to be grass around somewhere on the ground, but yeah, they were not content to eat that. They were willing to go through all this energy because they weren't content. And that's analogy applies to a lot of Christians. You know, they're never content with where God has them. They're always striving for, you know, something else, some other position, or instead of, Lord, where do you have me? Where do you want me to be? You know, where am I positioned? What you've called me to a certain place, and that's where I need to be content. Paul said he was content no matter what the circumstances, whether he was in prison or, you know, shipwreck or had all kinds of money. It didn't matter. He was content because he knew where he was in the Lord. Goats are never content with what they have. Again, it was, you know, there was several different pictures showing, you know, they were reaching out or, you know, doing different things. This picture here is just contrary to the picture that I showed with the sheep. I showed two pictures, Leonard with the sheep, and in both of those pictures, the sheep were following the shepherd. The shepherd always led, the sheep followed. Goats have a tendency to want to do their own thing. They have a tendency to be in the front. They're not very good followers. And that's sometimes in the congregation, that's where sometimes there can be some division. It was interesting that one of the things that on Perry Stone's interview that they talked about was the fact that the sheepfolds normally had one or two goats and a couple of goats, but they kept the number down. And Perry Stone made the reference that, think about that in the spiritual realm. And when we sometimes have small churches, everything seems to be going good and easy, you know, everything's good, and all of a sudden the church starts to blossom and to grow in size, and then all of a sudden it seems like, well, there's a little confusion here. Well, what's going on here? This is out of order or something, and it's because the number of goats have increased, and a large number of goats, when the goats increase in the size of the flock, he said that they bring confusion and they disrupt the tendency for the goats or the sheep to want to follow. There's, Maria was telling me about this, and I actually came across it in this research, that she said she had heard that there was actually meat packers, people that when they get ready to take the sheep to the slaughter, that they would use a goat that had been trained up, and that was his whole purpose. He would lead because they have a tendency to want to do their thing, but yet the sheep want to follow, and the sheep would follow this goat. And they said the nickname has been called the Judas, would lead the sheep to the slaughter. And this goat would be used several times in a day's time. And think about that. In our spiritual realm and the reality of who we are, how many times have goats, those Christians who are not wanting to lead, but they're wanting to do their own kind of things, sometimes led other sheep astray? Goats in a congregation tend to divide, leading the sheep astray. The size of the flock and the number of goats need to be kept to a minimum. And I love this part, where we were talking about this after service. When you think of goats, what do you think of? Bet, bet. In the spiritual part, everything is, well, the Word of God says this, but, well, we need to pray about this, but, and what happens when we think about that? There's the butting of heads. Sheep are always, and you see this picture of these two little ones fixing to butt heads. And what's that bring into the congregation? In the spiritual realm, that brings confusion, it brings disharmony, strife, and division, and all of a sudden, these things that shouldn't be in the congregation are taking place. This was one of the pictures I used earlier, Leonard, that shows that the sheep are led by the shepherd. John 10:4 says, and when he brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. The goat, on the other hand, they say, even though the goat may know the shepherd's voice, they have a tendency to want to do their own thing, not to respond, to kind of go off and try to be themselves. One of the words that was used was goats are stubborn. And the guy talked about an instance he remembered as a kid. The friend of his had a goat, and they would actually have to grab the goat by the horns and try to lead him, and that goat would do everything that he could do to keep from going the direction that he wanted. And our neighbors would get out there and call for Bert and Molly to come over, and they would just stand out there underneath the trees and just, even though the grass on their side was thicker and deeper than in our pasture, because I usually kept it mowed, they're over there wanting to do their, and he would get them back in. He'd fix the place where they would get out, and it would be next day or 2 days later, and they'd be back out again. They would be, they were not content to be where they were at. When they decided they wanted to go back, man, they were going back over there. And I don't know if you could have kept them from getting back over, but until they wanted to go, it was like until they wanted to go, they weren't going. So who do you say that I am? And that's the same question Jesus keeps asking, and in this particular part, it would be, are you a sheep? Are you one that follows, or are you one of the goats that want to have the tendency to do your own thing apart from the shepherd? Amen? That's all right. Good. Hopefully we have no goats, right? We've got very minimal. I can think of once in a while some people that have